So the critical thing that happened earlier this year with Ethereum and the blockchain plays to some of the themes that we've just been discussing. So the idea of the blockchain is that it's a radically disintermediated system of authority. So, you know, the notion of where authority lies is completely disaggregated. So no individual should have full knowledge of anything that happens in the blockchain. When the weak code was exposed earlier this year, it meant that someone had to make a central decision, which went against the entire philosophy of the blockchain. And that's the problem of the hard fork. So the community of Ethereum were offered 3 options. You have to be a shareholder, in a sense, to be able to make decisions. So there's also that problem as well, that only people who have access to resources can actually be a member of a blockchain, so, which is another philosophical debate to have. Because that's also a form of centralisation. But they were offered 3 choices: no fork, give no forks, have a soft fork, or have a hard fork. And this was incredibly hotly contested. And you know, there were purists who said the blockchain is disaggregated, so if there's weak code, so be it. That's the risk. It's survival of the fittest. Or you have people saying, no, we must clean the code up because we're all losing money, which is what was going on. So we want a hard fork where we reset the code and close down the vulnerability. And they ended up voting for that. So they basically voted for a centralised system of authority for intervention. So here you have all these people signed on to radical disintermediation and disaggregation, suddenly going, oh, but I'm losing money. Now I would like it to be centralised. Thanks. It's a fascinating area of both philosophy. It plays to notions of the archive, to notions of centralisation. It's a really, really interesting case study.
I think it's a request for a little more expansion on some of that, although it might be distracting from the Ubiquitous Archive stuff. But the one example that I caught of actually how a blockchain works in real life is a television contract, which is kind of a canonical example of people holding on to content and only letting it through a money gatekeeping. And that makes enforcing that power even easier. Like, you've got the people who have all the knowledge, the technology and the content, and these poor suffering consumers on the other side, if you like, which was just interesting juxtaposed with the whole, you know, the Internet Archive, which is kind of fight back against that. Is there a better example of how blockchain might do the thing that you're saying it's doing, which is distributing the power around?
I'll hand over to Cassie on that one.
Yes, and you're right, you know, blockchain, smart contracts can be coded for good or evil. Like, you know, they have both potentials. One example that I thought of recently was a smart contract that was related to government records, in a sense that you could encode for a particular categorisation or particular classification of records out of a particular business area, that a time-based period would elapse, and then they would be published on the internet for, you know, greater accessibility. And you know, and I know Peter Van Garderen in Canada, ex-Artifactual, is doing work on blockchain-based metadata for immutable immutable control records for archival information that's stored in distributed servers, so that there are ways to keep archival information that is available to everyone. But yeah, you're right.
Peer-reviewed journals in academic context is another application of the blockchain that's being looked at the moment. It's an interesting moment to be thinking of the blockchain because most academics now believe peer review is broken, irretrievably broken, for lots of conceptual reasons. And just as that happens, suddenly a technology arises that may in fact rescue it. So that's a kind of interesting little paradox going on in terms of scholarship.
There's also a lot of really interesting work, and I'd encourage you to look at the Peer-to-Peer Foundation online, and because they're very interested in how this technology can be used to kind of support reward from work that doesn't involve a lot of infrastructure or a centralised sort of bank or employment authority or something, that people can be given value, whether it be financial or other kinds of value for work done in ways that opens up that kind of possibility to people that might have been shut out of other economies.
Yeah, and that from that then is the other kinds of things that arise as you were describing them, which is this idea that if nobody knows everything, it is much easier to exploit vulnerability. And I think that that's something that we haven't really grappled with very effectively in relation to these new technologies. So systems of regulation that are designed to produce equity, for example, which we happily accept culturally, aren't necessarily at play in the world of the blockchain.
Oh,
That'd be you.
Seamless. So returning to ubiquity, so Deb, I don't think I followed Luther entirely, but it seemed in the kind of Lutheran notion, and it's probably fair enough, that in the kind of Lutheran notion of ubiquity that boundaries are dissolved. And I heard in Mike your talk that boundaries were blurred and they were exploded. But then in Cassie's talk about the blockchain, well, chains have links and boundaries are very important. And in graphs, it's all about edges. And so boundaries, it's not necessarily that they're erased entirely, but that they're kind of distributed and spread and pluralized and democratized. So I'm just wondering about boundaries in an ubiquitous archive. Will they eventually just fade away entirely, or do they become almost more important but just everywhere?
Yeah, so you're talking to an atheist, which makes some of these concepts kind of more slightly complicated for me. So I'm only dealing with them at the level of the highly theoretical, okay? And so what's going on in the Reformation is a whole bunch of questions around exactly what you've just asked, right? Because if God's in everything, right, when you put the Eucharist in your mouth, are you actually eating God? Because that's a really big problem in the Reformation for them to have to deal with. So then they start kind of creating these new ideas around things like definitive existence, so that they have edges to notions of ubiquity as well. So there's untrammeled ubiquity, and then there's kind of negotiated ubiquity and so on, because they're trying to grapple with the full impact of what they're describing. So I really skipped a lot of that stuff to get my 15-minute explanation of the entire history of the universe out in one or two sentences. So I think your question's really great, because what you're asking is, we have a lived reality. How do we experience the untrammeled, the global, the universal, all these notions that are aspirational but not necessarily experienced?
Yeah, and I think the other sort of extension of that is that, that there are certainly boundaries that are drawn at various times, but there's always something on the other side of the boundary that's also a connection to something broader, and that has a connection to something broader than that. So boundaries don't block things off from the things that are the other side of that boundary. They're just a sort of, if you like, arbitrary sort of culturally constructed delineation that needs to be there for practical purposes at various points, but can always be overstepped.
For me, the only thing I just thought of was the boundaries that we've seen to date in record-keeping archives have been set by legislation, by national boundaries, by all those sorts of formal boundaries. The boundaries that we are thinking, or I'm thinking about with using this kind of technology, decentralisation, are communities of trust around particular things that they say are important to them, and they're creating their own boundaries.
So just following on from that, if we think of archives as a form of cultural infrastructure or knowledge infrastructure, then they occupy a position of mediation somewhere between the notion of the untrammeled and the very, very local lived experience of the world. And I guess what I'm trying to do in this session is ask, where have we set that bar, and why do we set it there? So what sort of administrative units define containers or notions of knowledge and knowledge transfer? In our case in Australia, it's usually the national, and then there's the state, and so on, and the community archives, and then down to the personal. And these are all forms of containment or mediation. But maybe we can think differently about that. Maybe there are different ways of configuring those mediations, and one of them is this notion of now the global. How do we think about a universal archive or a global archive? Why do we stop at the nation? Australia's history is not just about Australia. But we tend to stop it there for administrative and funding reasons. What happens if we explode that and just go, wow, what would a different kind of set of containers look like?
Yeah, I think for me, there will always be boundaries, and there have to be boundaries even in the blockchain world. But it makes the conversations explicit. We surface where we have to have explicit conversations about boundaries, and about trust. And to a certain extent, the blockchain stuff kicks the can down the road a little bit, but it doesn't remove the need to have conversations about trust, particularly in the shorter term when I was thinking about the land transfer example, where if you're actually going to hold all of the titles in the blockchain, that becomes a very large thing. If you're not, then you need some repository to hold the titles anyway, and then you've got the same sorts of problems about trusting who's holding the titles to begin with.
So there are projects that are looking at, there's a project called the Interplanetary File System, IPFS, which is a distributed sort of file storage infrastructure that links up, you know, computers all around the world and has that sort of consensus model for how they are stored, which is similar to the blockchain. And because the blockchain, you're right, can't cope with big sets of data being encoded into it, or it can sort of, but it's not optimal. So people are looking at metadata in the blockchain and files stored in things like the IPFS to get around and to try to continue that model.
Yep. So you're reliant on a many copies kind of model. So the trust then moves from one to a number.
Yes, and it's a bit like locks.
Yeah.
And that gets back to that idea of scale that I was trying to get at, which is that it's not just about trying to think of time itself as the key issue in Ubiquity, it's scale. It's that ability to move up and down registers. And so if we think of scale, blockchain is one example of thinking of scale, but there are other ways we can think about scale in the archive, and we do it all the time. I mean, when archives build our file structures, you're talking about patterning that works within an archive but also works in other settings, and you kind of reach that up into the archive in some way. So patterning is a really interesting way to think about scale.
And I think just going back to your initial point about the need to be explicit about boundaries, I mean, there's been work done on this recently, and particularly in Australia, you know, writing by people like Mitchell Whitelaw and Tim Sherratt about seamlessness and seamfulness, and this idea that you know, when you get to larger scales, people sometimes talk about the idea of it being seamless and just. But that becomes really undifferentiated, and you end up with the difficult spaces to navigate and use in any particular way. So you can always kind of, you know, almost in a sort of fractal sense, move up and down in terms of detail, but you can also define where those seams are, where joins are between things, and those joins themselves could always be otherwise, or they're always constructed. It's being explicit about those too.
And again, it's that a scale. Sorry, the infinitely detailed and the monumentally large aren't incommensurable. Now, in the lives we lead now, that's an experience that we actually can have and do have, and maybe was understood differently in the Middle Ages and the Reformation in a religious sense, and that's why we're sort of drawing on that idea of ubiquity and how we can rethink that for a contemporary setting, because I think what happened in the intervening years, like in the Enlightenment years, was a very bounded and contained notion of how knowledge was structured. And taxonomies and classifications. And so I guess what we're doing is trying to skip a few centuries and just see what happens when you do that, which is a sort of ubiquitous treatment of time in itself.
Thanks. You've possibly just answered my question, which is, and apologies, this might be a bit incoherent. I'm still struggling with the cognitive dissonance of what I've heard, but...
We all are. It's okay.
Cool. It seems to me there's an inherent tension still, though. You mentioned that sort of mediated layer between the sort of the top and the bottom in terms of the ubiquity and the parochial. And that tension has kind of been implied to be resolved almost by the archival function or the archival agency in terms of the skill sets that we may bring to how we look at stuff, both in terms of the temporal, so we typically tend to take a long-term view, but also the specific in terms of what it is that we decide to archive. Is that resolvable? Do you see that sort of that role, that long-term thing that we do being retained, or is that sort of by this whole process rendered redundant? We just assume and accept what's been created.
See, I rather than think about the long term, I try and think about whether we live with time or without time. Some people in our worlds now have less time than others, and there's been some really interesting discussion here about using archives to preserve the histories of Pacific Islanders who are losing their islands, and so on. And these are very real questions. We live in a period of the Anthropocene where time is radically changing. Our experience of it, our sense of it, the tactile nature of it in the way we move and walk and do our lives, right? So for me, when you talk about the long term, that's a linear notion of time that I just don't see, I don't even believe we have. I'm a climate change pessimist, quite frankly. We've lost the plot on climate change. We tipped. It's happened. There's no coming back. So how do we then rethink what we do as archivists in a situation where there may not actually be time in a linear sense anymore? What are we doing? And I think what we're doing is, and we have a fundamental role to do, is actually help people make meaning of that by redressing and addressing within our own institutions and our own practices and our own selves a sense of time and timeliness or timelessness. And that's what we can do really well, because we've been dwelling in that for a very long time. We've been doing it. We've been doing that. There are practices. We deal with time. And we're in a culture now that desperately needs help on thinking that through. And we can do it. But we need to do it creatively and not just using the kinds of structures and thinking about time that was delivered to us by the 19th century.
If I've understood you correctly, this is sort of about what we've already gone through as a profession, which is a shift from life cycle to continuum thinking. And so what we're actually on about is designing record keeping, thinking about records creation. And I think maybe some of the even further kind of concertinaing of some of our processes is natural with the digital world. And archives are going to have to keep pace with that and transform, unless they want to be stuck with the legacy role only.
So concepts like graceful degradation are very appealing to me, which is this idea that you design for obsolescence. So you're actually designing for the, in an archival sense, you're designing for the rats and the crickets. I know. It's a beautiful phrase, a graceful degradation. No, it's when you design technical systems knowing that those technical systems you're currently working with may not exist in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Good digital correct. So that should be happening anyway. But how do we think about something like graceful degradation in an archival context? Like, how will we design archives that actually encapsulate that kind of thinking? Are there any other questions? Have I really blown your mind? I did end with that atomic bomb deliberately. Is that a question or a stretch? It's a question. Multi-purposing.
It'd be nice to hear from all of you if you could put it into a single sentence, what each of you are trying to achieve by the Ubiquitous Archive. Because what I'm struggling with is I'm not clear on why we haven't got a Ubiquitous Archive anyway. Despite from organizations that, my archive doesn't have search engine optimization on top of their catalog, so it's not discoverable by Google. So Google doesn't help provide that aggregation to put our information out there. But
don't even get me started on Google.
Oh no, that's another. And I also don't think we're easily scraped by the Internet Archive. But where am I going? But without being able to understand exactly what you want, I'm not sure why we haven't got ubiquity. And I'm also wondering if in the network model, we end up with there's 3 values: a subject, a predicate, and an object. But then there's the concept of freedom of speech as well, where I guess anyone can have an opinion about anything. And the important thing about the triple is actually the 4th element, which is provenance, which is what we provide. And so usually in a network model, it's actually it's where you create that 4th dimension where you say Archives New Zealand has got this record from here and it publishes it to here, and you have that notion of trust, and then you connect all of all of those up, then you start to see the continuum model probably, because it starts to become, it's, you know, multi-dimensional. So is that another approach? Anyway, but anyway,
Who wants
first
to start?
question.
You've mentioned all my pet hates. So you better start, because I'll go first.
I'm still getting my thoughts together around that. No, but I can say something. I think some of the things that you said in that response to me are some of the concepts which, even though we need to deal with them in our everyday work, we were probably trying to get away from to some extent in this session of my archive has this and it makes it available to these people via these sorts of means. That, you know, there is some level of ubiquity in the sense that if you step outside of those sorts of models and boundaries, the things that you have are related to all sorts of things that your organisation doesn't have and that aren't in there, and those exist through multiple periods of time and in multiple spaces. And something which I think Deb would probably agree with, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that rather than just having a sort of node and a link between them, that the nodes themselves are formed and shaped and changed by the nature of that connection that exists between them. They're not stable things in their own right. So that sort of interaction and interaction between those two things that are both inside your world or what you deal with and outside it help to sort of shape the meaning of all of those sort of aspects. So I guess what we're doing in this session, or what I was hoping to achieve, is to step outside some of those specific models of things just being aggregated into a space from particular places with set meanings.
One thing, when you talked about why don't we have the Ubiquitous Archive already, for me, you know, the archive is always forming and has the potential in all these areas, and Anne Gilliland talks about the silences and the gaps in the archive, and so that's partly what I think this is about, is the kind of thinking about how to fill those gaps and silences with the sort of alternative record-keeping models that don't require you to have resources and power and all that.
Sorry, I'm in the middle of responding to someone in the audience by Twitter, but scale. It's all scale. Okay, so part of my attraction to the notion of ubiquity comes from my own work in terms of interoperating data. You know, data is inherently social in nature. Data just loves to hang out with data. It's kind of set up that way. And in many ways it's more social than the people who manipulate it, which is also kind of intriguing. Or it's better set up for that. However, the systems that we've put in place to interoperate data are fairly limited. I mean, RDF is limited, right? Triples are ridiculously limited. Who thinks of the world in terms of triples? Do I experience the world as triples? Of course not. I experience the world in terms of massive amounts of contingency, complexity, interpretability that can't ever be contained in a triple. So the world of triples and data interoperability as it currently stands is limiting and not a good exemplar of a notion of ubiquity that I would be striving for. Okay? If we really want that notion of the multiple contingencies of time being contained in the one moment and everything, in a sense, occupying in both hidden and explicit ways spaces of time or senses of time, triples are not the answer. And you know, one of the things I think that we've been delivered by largely technical infrastructure that's largely been built by scientists who work with logical progressive notions of how you solve problems, is it hasn't done us very well in non-STEM spaces for understanding the complexities of life. And that saddens me because, of course, in this country, the entire innovation debate is dominated by the idea that only science produces good innovation. And the rest of us, who are trying to get on with the idea of understanding the world as a complex, negotiated set of spaces, are not in that debate. And it sucks.
Deb, you introduced notions of apocalypse, and the immutable thing in your talk was the nuclear waste that was going to haunt us many years in the future. And Cassie, you noted
it haunts us now.
That the blockchain technologies and blockchains are immutable artifacts, and Mike, you showed us Wiener's Wien. Are you all, like Cassie said, welcoming our machine overlords and bringing on the apocalypse? is the Ubiquitous Archive something to be feared? And are there affordances in local archives like the Warnham Dreaming Centre that are local and that obsolete and that are mutable,
Yes.
that are worth preserving? And
I think, yeah, just very, very quickly, because I want to get to Kirsten. Yes, I think there is definitely something to be feared in ubiquity, and not just from the immutable point of view, but when I think about a ubiquitous archive, I also think about the panopticon, and I think about surveillance, and I think about the quantities of data that are kept on us all the time, every day, right now, on the phone, in your pocket, being recorded by Google and Apple and Facebook. So I think you've sounded a word of caution quite sensibly.
That was actually a really good segue into what I was going to ask, so thank you. I guess I had a question about archives, power and neutrality, just in the last 2 minutes. I was interested, Cassie, in particular, that you mentioned that blockchain perhaps offers neutrality in a way that an institution or a more bounded archive can. And I guess I was interested in your thoughts about whether neutrality is still something to aim for, if it's possible to aim for, and does ubiquity in that sense equal neutrality?
Yeah, and it's I should be clear, because the actors that write the code, often the code itself, are not necessarily neutral. What is neutral is the execution of that code, and then the records made and kept, in that they are uncorruptible by someone just going in and going, I'm just going to tweak this here and no one's going to notice. I'm going to liquid paper over that name and sign it differently. I'm going to... the neutrality is more akin to what, trusted third-party repositories, holding things in escrow, holding things in a space where the parties can agree that's all okay. But yeah, I agree completely. Nothing is neutral, really, in the real world, and so, yeah.
I'm going for ubiquitous time, it's just going on and on.
I won't get on my butterbox about do we live in an economy or a society. I suspect we seem to be living in the first. But I suppose my biggest concern is with the blockchain technology. I mean, it seems to be very exclusive. If you're not in it, you're not part of it. So it's not very democratic.
Look, absolutely agree. There are barriers of entry for you if you're not kind of 26 wearing a hoodie and brain the size of a planet. And if you don't have the technology, if you don't have access to technology. But again, because we're running out of time, there are some really interesting experiments around the commons and around new types of economies and engaging in the real world with people that are sort of don't have access to that stuff, and how technology can help that. So peer-to-peer foundation, people like that doing some interesting stuff.
Also, one of my criticisms of some of the assessments of the blockchain is that you actually have to be in the blockchain to get it, like to understand it, and therefore you're invested, literally invested, like you pay money, and so you benefit from talking it up. So a lot of the hype is driven by people writing it up because they themselves are already effectively shareholders. Yeah.
Very exciting note. I'm going to call this discussion to a close. And thank our panel members. Thank you.
Thank you.